When buying a GPU, you're faced with a lot of choices, down to not only what GPU core you want, whether that be a 4070 Ti Super or 4080 Super for instance, but also what variant of that GPU. And that generally comes down to a few factors, with the main one being price. But what if you're faced with the decision of buying something like the Founders Edition from Nvidia or something a bit different from another brand? Well, that's what we're going to look at today. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits for my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard and 32 gig of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits. Or, if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver. Thanks. But where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. You call me the stupid one.
So in terms of what we have here today, both cards are, as mentioned, MSRP, so you're not paying a premium with the Inno card over the Nvidia Founders model. Instead, you're getting a very different card in terms of stylistic design choices, especially with the Inno card that comes in as a dual slot card, which I've got to say is pretty impressive for a GPU as powerful as a 4080 Super. Now in terms of clock speeds, both cards come in identically with a 2295 MHz base clock, 2550 MHz boost clock, and the same 23 gigabit per second memory clock. Now if you are wanting something a bit beefier than that, then Inno among other brands do have OC models of their cards, but it also does seem like Inno's overclock model isn't a dual slot card, so there are some sacrifices there. Now talking about size, the Founders card comes in at 304mm long, 137mm wide, and will take up 3 slots in your case, which is pretty typical for a GPU of this calibre. Now the Inno 3D card however comes in quite a bit longer as it's essentially been pancaked. This means it's 33mm longer at 337mm, 4mm taller at 141, and is much thinner to satisfy that dual slot design, which I honestly think will appeal to a lot of gamers, especially considering there's lots of cases on the market now that are deeper than they are wider, so there's definitely a market for something like this. In terms of cooling, these cards really couldn't be any more different from each other. The Nvidia Founders design is certainly unique with a fan either side and a more industrious look, while Inno's card looks more typical of what you'd expect a graphics card to look like with a triple fan design, hence the X3 naming structure. Both cards do definitely look more professional than gamery with no huge amounts of RGB and mixed materials that would make either of them look great inside both a home or office system. Now admittedly, the Founders is more subtle with its stealth black design, but the mixed grey black colour scheme for the X3 card really works, and due to its size and shape that has a almost flattened look to it, it's reminiscent of a workstation GPU, more so than a consumer GPU that's made for gaming. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, and definitely makes it stand out, but in a good way. The biggest thing the Inno card has going for it, to a degree, is compatibility. The Founders card is thick, taking up 3 slots on the I/O, but also utilising that in terms of the depth of the cooler, while Inno's card is 2 slots and the shroud of the cooler doesn't protrude beyond that. And that's why those wanting a smaller form factor system, obviously taking the height and length into consideration, could potentially see that as a big bonus point. Now while we all know that the Nvidia FE card gives great value for money in terms of being MSRP based, the Inno card still feels like it should be more expensive, just based on the initial design and quality of it. Now one area that may be cause for concern to some will be the weight. The Inno card is significantly lighter at 1,555 grams compared to Nvidia's 2,425 grams. That's a pretty staggering 870 gram difference. While the Nvidia card does feel very solid when holding it, it's not like the Inno feels cheap or anything, it still feels very robust. Then in terms of power, both cards come with the same 320 watt TGP and incorporate a single 12V HPWR connector on the top of the card, of which both cards come with a triple 8-pin to 12V HPWR adapter included in the box. Around the rear, again, this is where things differ massively, as the Founders card has that second fan that, if mounting the card horizontally in your case, would work to expel air upwards and eventually exhaust out of your case. And along with some nice subtle branding, there isn't really too much else going on here. And that's, I guess, the beauty of the Founders card, a simple, elegant and stylish design. The Inno card is much more typical of a, let's say, normal looking graphics card, with a full backplate that covers the complete rear of the card, with some large cutouts that extend beyond the PCB to help with dissipating heat. Again, there's no gamery gimmicks here, instead with just some simple Inno 3D branding, along with the GeForce RTX logo and a barcode sticker that maybe could have been located better, but that's just me being a bit picky. Connection wise, the two cards are identical with 3 DisplayPort connectors and a single HDMI, so pretty typical of what you'd expect, and we'll get multi-monitor setups running in no time at all. Now, due to the sheer size of the Inno card, they do supply a 3-piece stand, which just sits on top of your power supply shroud, and overall is quite simple, with no branding, but it does have a grippy base and is adjustable up and down depending on the location inside your case. It's fine, but we have seen better from other brands, while Nvidia don't even give you one, but as they use a large unibody design, doesn't really need one, though some consumers may worry due to its sheer weight, but making sure the I/O plate is screwed in properly should negate any worries anyway. Taking both of the cards apart is, well, very different. The Founders card opts for a discrete hidden screw system where the fans connect via a ribbon style cable, much like you'd expect on a laptop of some kind, whereas Inno is much more typical of a conventional graphics card. The Founders, I would say, is much harder to take apart due to its design, and we've stripped it down kind of as far as what we feel most would even be comfortable in doing. And this shows the plate that makes direct contact with the GPU core and memory, along with separate metal plates that help cool the circuitry down. The Inno card is very different, with a pretty sizable heatsink that is quite slim, but due to the extra height and length, it provides much more surface area for heat to escape to. They've also one-upped Nvidia with 7 heat pipes compared to the Founders 6, and in a similar style, both the GPU and VRAM are cooled by a single plate, while the circuitry sits under smaller plates which feed into the heat pipes. Another difference is on the backplate, where Nvidia's FE card does include a few thermal pads, while Inno have opted to not have any, which, in all honesty, is a bit of an odd move considering the cost of adding in a few strips, and this may let them down slightly in the cooling department. In terms of the PCBs, the Nvidia card uses an 11-phase design using monolithic MP86957 MOSFETs that are rated for 70 amps each, and are managed by the monolithic MP2891 controller, which also handles the memory phases, which uses the same MP86957 70 amp phases in a 2-phase configuration. Inno have gone slightly bigger with 17 phases, which are split by having 14 for the GPU and 3 for the memory. Inno plumped for using the ON semiconductor NCP302150MN TWG MOSFETs, which are rated for 50 amps each. Controller wise, they're using the UP9512R controller for the GPU phases and the UP9529 controller for the memory, so a higher phase count but less power per phase. What this means for overclocking we'll find out in a little bit, but due to how locked down the 40 series cards are anyway, I'm not really expecting anything huge in terms of headroom. Now, in terms of stock performance, card to card we don't typically see much in the way of extra performance beyond that of margin of error. To confirm this, we put both cards onto our GPU test bench to see what figures we could get in a few games. It's here in A Plague Tale where the FE does manage to come in 8% faster in the averages, though this does only equate to just 4 FPS. In terms of the lows, it ends up packing 11% more performance, but again, only really results in 5 frames per second. In Alan Wake 2, there's still a margin difference in favour of the FE card by 6% in the averages and 4% in the 1% lows. Though again, we're only talking a few FPS because we ran all of our tests at 4K on higher than normal settings to really stress each card and push them to their fullest. Now, we couldn't continue without putting the cards through their paces in Cyberpunk on the Ultra preset, and again we see a small difference in favour of the Nvidia FE card, with 4% more performance. While this could be argued as margin of error, it's quite a small difference of just 2 frames per second. Then in Starfield we're talking just 3% between the two cards, with the FE taking the lead by 3 FPS, and the same 3 PS difference in the 1% lows. So both cards are within the same realm of each other in terms of performance, though the FE does come in, I guess, slightly stronger, but nothing of huge significance, and the margins look a little bigger due to the lower frame rates overall. Now, in terms of cooling performance and clock speed, the cards were very different. While the Founders came in with a GPU core temperature of 62 degrees, the Inno card did come in higher at 68 degrees, but still within tolerable limits. The hotspot on the Founders sat at around 73 degrees, while the Inno card again came in higher at 81 degrees. In terms of the memory temperature, it was much closer, with the FE maxing out around 68 degrees, and the Inno at the same 68 degrees at its peak, but it did actually average lower, closer to 66 degrees. The biggest difference came by way of the boost speed, with the Nvidia FE boosting to a little over 2800 MHz, while Inno's X3 card only managed 2665 MHz max. For power, both cards came in well below the 320 watt TGP and saw Nvidia topping at around 272 watts for total board power, while Inno came in a little higher at 300 watts, but still well below Nvidia's reference rated power limit. For acoustics, again, the Nvidia card was the better of the two, with the fans only spinning up to around 1300 RPM, which is barely even audible, while Inno did push a bit harder at 1600 RPM, which is more audible in comparison, but still nothing to worry about. Now, one area that can be quite a big difference is when looking at overclocking. There's so many variables at play, including the cooler, the binning processor, the GPU itself, and just plain silicon lottery, where no two GPU cores will ever perform identically or the same. It's here where we increase the power and temperature limits to their maximum and set to work on increasing both the core clock speed and memory clock. Now, on the Nvidia FE card, we were able to increase the power limit to 110%. After some time increasing both of the clocks, we settled at a stable 200 MHz core clock and 1500 MHz memory clock. This resulted in a GPU clock of 2495 MHz, a subsequent boost clock of 2750 MHz, and a memory clock of 1625 MHz. And to make sure that it was 100% stable, we again ran F123 for an hour. If the game crashed or we saw any form of artifacting, we simply dialed things back down and started the timer again. Now, with the FE card, that wasn't the case and things ran as they should. Then, as we moved over to the Inno card, the power limit was already at its max, which is 100%, so I was expected to see things a bit lower on this card in comparison to the Nvidia FE. We were still able to get a sizable overclock though, with a 165 MHz core clock increase and 1300 MHz on the memory clock. Once overclocking was done, it was time to see what that meant for our performance results in-game. It's here where in A Plague Tale, both cards see a 5% improvement from overclocking, which equates to a 3 FPS increase in the averages. With these increases though, the Inno still falls a little behind the Founders, with the overclock result closing the gap on the FE's original stock FPS, but still not managing to overtake it, falling just 1 FPS behind. Moving over to Alan Wake 2, we see much of the same. Each card sees improvements from overclocking, with the Founders managing to gain 7% more FPS from the overclock, resulting in an increase of 4 FPS in the averages, now coming in with an FPS of 57. Meanwhile, whilst the Inno does see a smaller 4% increase in FPS, that only works out to be 2 frames per second, meaning that we only moved up to 52 FPS average, which still sits behind the pre-overclock result we saw on the Founders card. Cyberpunk 2077 was the only game that saw the overclock performance of the Inno beat the stock performance of the Founders Edition, albeit only technically, because when we start to look a little closer, we notice that it actually matches the average performance identically, with the only increase coming by way of a 1 FPS improvement in the 1% lows, so nothing noticeable really, and what can be deemed as margin of error. Regardless, the Inno actually did see the healthiest improvement from overclocking, gaining 4% more performance compared to the 2% that Nvidia saw. But it would be remiss of me not to point out that both cards only saw a margin of error increase anyway, and it's realistically nothing you'd ever notice in gaming. Finally, we have Starfield, where the Founders card saw a pretty decent improvement from overclocking, with a 6% increase in FPS, and whilst this doesn't sound like that much, it is worth remembering that this game has the highest results of all the games we tested, so by comparison the percentages look a little smaller. The Inno also saw a decent uplift, gaining 4% more FPS over the stock speeds, with the overclock result now matching that of the Founders' stock performance, but falling behind by just 1 FPS in the 1% lows. With our overclock stable, we went back to F1 to see how the cards handle a prolonged gaming session. It's here where we saw the Founders' core temperature now sitting at a perfectly reasonable 63 degrees, whilst the Inno sits at a higher but still manageable 69 degrees. The Founders' hotspot stayed at 73 degrees, whilst the Inno did jump up to a much higher 82 degrees, but this is still no cause for concern. Then, in terms of memory temperatures, we saw 68 degrees once again on the Founders, with the Inno matching that exactly, with the same 68 degrees at its peak. What this means for the actual clock speeds of the cards is pretty significant, with the Founders being perfectly stable even with its clock speed of 2995 MHz, and with a little more tweaking, I'm sure you could push this beyond 3000 if you did some kind of more work with the fan speeds. The Inno wasn't quite so high, but still saw a respectable clock speed of 2820 MHz, which is, I guess, a decent improvement over stock. Then lastly, in terms of the fans on the FE, we saw them sitting at around 1320 RPM for the most part, which is barely audible. Whilst the Inno sat at a much higher 1740 RPM, which was louder, but nothing you'd hear over your game anyway. To get a better idea as to how temperatures look between the two cards at both stock and overclock configurations, we've laid it out in an easy to view chart. Therefore, looking at the GPU temperature, the FE was the cooler of the two cards, even when overclocked. But even then, both cards only saw a 1 degree difference when overclocked between that and their stock results. Then, in terms of the hotspot temperature, again, Nvidia was the cooler of the two, and overclocking saw no visible difference in temperatures on the FE. The Inno card, which was the hotter of the two, again only saw a 1 degree difference in temperature, but could be argued as margin of error based on ambient temperature being a point or two higher at the time of testing. Then, when we look at the memory junction temperature, the Inno was the coolest of the two cards at stock, and overclocking it saw it increase to the same levels as the FE card at 68 degrees, which remained the same even when overclocked. So what can we take away from all of this? Well, to start with, the performance. I'm not saying that Nvidia bin their cards better, especially when it comes to the ones that they send out to reviewers, but we'll never know, and I guess it's always a possibility, even if highly unlikely. That could be the reason why we saw higher performance on the FE card in comparison to the Inno, though even then, as we did test at 4K on pretty high settings, the percentages seem maybe higher than what they actually represent in terms of frame rates. Even in the cases where performance was up to 7% more with overclocks, it only really boiled down to 4 FPS. And if we're kind of taking margin of error into account, then that could draw even closer to just 1 or 2 FPS, which you're never going to notice when it comes to real-world gaming and the experience that's presented to you. The other reason, and the more, let's say, likely reason, is the cooler and the design of the Inno card. Now, let's not beat around the bush here. The Nvidia FE is huge. It's fairly long in the grand scheme of things, it's fairly tall too, but the big part comes down to its thickness. Taking up 3 slots is quite typical these days if you're buying a pre-overclocked custom AIB card like an iChill X3OC that has a kind of targeted audience of people wanting the very best overclocking, cooling and performance. But when you're talking MSRP, like what we've got here today, you're probably looking to get something understated. And that's where the Founders is a great card, but it has a caveat, and that, I think, is where Inno come out on top. Thickness. If you're utilising a smaller form factor system, you're more than likely not going to be able to get a Founders card, because you're going to be restricted to a dual slot solution. And that's where I think Inno have kind of gone with this and why they've decided to go with this. Sure, a cube-like small form factor case may still have its limitations, but a HTPC or something slim is going to be perfect for a dual slot monster like the Inno X3 card. And as far as I know, it's the only dual slot air-cooled 4080 Super on the market, so there are potentially sacrifices in the performance and cooling. But in all honesty, it's not enough to really worry about, considering it may be the only choice you have if you're one of those using a smaller form factor system. So the big question, which one should you buy? Well, it's a tricky one, because I think I've explained that they are for very different users, and kind of looking at bypassing limitations that may actually be presented to you. I won't lie and say that I'd go for one over the other, because they're both great looking cards, and they perform within a margin of each other, though the Nvidia does boost slightly higher, and that may sell it to some people. So if you're all about performance, then yes, Nvidia gets the win. But if you can't fit it in your case, then the Inno is the logical choice. So there we go. That's going to do it for this one. Let me know, what one would you actually go for? Would a couple of frames put you off buying one over the other? And if you do have a smaller form factor build, would you be eyeing up the Inno X3? Because I guess typically you'd have to get something lower end to fulfill that size requirement. Whereas now, you at least, I don't know, have some choice. Also, if you enjoyed this video, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, you can help support us over on Patreon, where you get a ton of exclusive benefits, including behind the scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, monthly Patreon only live streams, and much, much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.